It is really hard to grow food here because we have such a short growing season, but if we can utilize the forest that we have to make different foods that we're not used to but are still really good for us, then that's where we should be heading.
Forest farming was introduced to me earlier this year, actually, in a college level course I was taking. It's really interesting. What you generally do is go into a woods, go into a forested area, much like the Adirondacks, and you use the trees as ways to protect your crop, but also as a means to intersperse plants. One of our main issues, whenever anyone says climate change, is everyone thinks carbon. Trees take in carbon naturally.
65% of this state is forest. Most of that is privately owned. Everyone understands that forests, natural forests, are an important part of our ecosystems. What's happened in the last couple of decades is what we are now calling forest farming, which has to do with growing a range of different non-timber forest crops beneath this established canopy. And there was a movement in North America, so-called tree-based agriculture, where a couple of pioneers, including the fellow named Smith and McDaniels, who was the founder of the McDaniels nut grove, advocated growing trees in parts of the U.S. that were not suited for field agriculture.
We've been doing this class and just kind of slowly, shifting it and adding more crops and just kind of working with it. It's very unique to start with an 80-year-old nut forest that someone planted as a site to play in. That's pretty special. We look at forest farming and agroforestry entirely as a complement to conventional agriculture. We're not trying to get everybody to stop growing corn and start growing chestnuts right away, but we could plant a row of chestnuts in between rows of corn and start to transition to something that's a little more perennial and a little more resilient and stable.
Agroforestry is a broader term. It's an umbrella, so to speak, which has to do generally with growing trees and crops together. More specifically, it's broken down into 5 practices: forest farming, but also alley cropping, growing rows of trees with other crops in between; riparian buffers, that is, growing trees and shrubs in the bank of a stream to prevent erosion; windbreaks, to mitigate wind, and that improves cattle performance, and crops grow better when the wind isn't too strong; and finally, silvopasture. And that involves grazing cattle and other livestock beneath a forest canopy. We grow a variety of crops in the forest farm beneath the canopy of an established forest. These fall into certain categories: medicinals, food crops, ornamental crops. The most important of the medicinal crops would be American ginseng. Another crop that we find fairly lucrative is mushrooms. Cultivated mushrooms like shiitake is the most important.
What's great about working with Ken is he's both into the concept, and then he's like, well, I'm going to do the research to back this stuff up. And shiitake culture is an Asian product. It's grown in a very different climate. There's a lot of questions, and so he spent 10 years researching this stuff and figuring out what works. And which is why now we have 50 growers in the Northeast that are growing mushrooms and starting to make money doing that, And so it's because of this end product, but it's also because of that dedicated work.
Most fruit crops, that is, trees and shrubs, berries, and so forth, are not particularly well adapted to growing under shade. But there are some that are reasonably well adapted to low light conditions and are suitable for forest farming. One of these is the pawpaw, which is a Native American fruit most people aren't familiar with.
Pawpaws actually, when they're ripe, they kind of look like a beat-up, bruised banana, but this is actually when they're perfect, and it's one of the limitations of them as a commercial crop because they just can't actually be shipped that easily. So what we're looking at is harvesting, getting them out to markets as quickly as possible, and then doing value-added, making jams, freezing the pulp, that kind of thing. It resembles very much both in the fruit and the vegetation a tropical plant, for sure. So that's what it looks like, and honestly the best way to eat it is with a spoon, just like custard. Eat it right out of the shell, pick the seeds out, and it's quite a dessert, you know, really on its own. You know, when we think about climate change, I mean, the ecosystems that are resilient in the face of flooding, high rain events, droughts, all those kind of things, tend to be wetlands and forests.